All right, so what we're going to do is we've got a bunch of tasks, and we're going to look at how we can use different anchor points, and how we can animate the anchor point, and how we can use other things as the anchor point. So in the first task 0, 0, animating the anchor point, it's pretty self-explanatory. So I want you to try and animate the square rolling down the ramp. So not sliding down, but rolling down the ramp. And to do so, you'll need to animate the anchor point. And then we'll look at where that causes issues and how we can improve that. So I'll give you 5 minutes or a little bit more to give that a go. Okay, so as you will have noticed, it's pretty painful. So I'll do a couple of things that you might have tried. So the first thing is that the first roll is pretty easy because I've already set up the anchor point for you. So all you need to do is rotate it. So what that means is if I keyframe rotation, then move along and change the rotation, then I've done one roll. The problem comes when we go to the next roll. So now I want to roll it around this corner, the other corner. So I need to move the anchor point. So I'll hit the Y tool and I'll move the anchor point and I'll rotate it. And I think that that works because if I look at that, it's working. But if I go back and look at the first one, it's not working anymore because the anchor point is not on the first point at that point in time. It's always on the second point. So I need to animate the anchor point between each roll. So I'll undo that. And I'll undo that, so it's got the first roll. And then I'll open up anchor point, so I'll hit A to see the anchor point. Or I could just open up the transform properties and see anchor point. But I'll hit R to see rotation, and then Shift A to see anchor point as well. And so I know at the start, for this section, I want the anchor point to be where it is. So I'll put a keyframe there. Then, when it gets to here, I want the anchor point to be over here now. So I'll hit Y, and I'll move the anchor point, and I'll see that it's given us a keyframe. But what's happened is, well, let's just do this rotation first and see that it does work. But what's happened is, we get a similar problem. So here, the anchor point is there, but between here and here, the anchor point is moving. So it's shifting, but there's also something else happening. Notice that the square doesn't go back here, it stays where it is. Because even though the anchor point has moved within the object, the position of the object isn't changing. The position is still considered to be here. So I forgot to animate position as well. If I'm animating anchor point, I also need to animate position. So let's go back again. And when I keyframe anchor point, I'll keyframe position. And now when I move the anchor point, we can watch this position value. It also changes because the position of the layer within the screen is governed by where the anchor point is. So that means the position needs to update in order for this to look like it's in the same spot. So I've got two new keyframes. Now I can rotate that again. And again, it looks like it works here, but I've still got an issue here. Because even though it now starts at the right spot, the anchor point is smoothly transitioning during this time. So I actually want it to hold this position right up until here. So I could copy those keyframes and put them here so that the anchor point and the position stay the same until here, and then suddenly it changes to the next bit. And I could put this a keyframe later if I wanted to, just as the roll starts. But it doesn't matter either side there. Now that works, but I can improve it. If I delete these, I can select these two keyframes and tell them to hold. And that means we're not going to get any in-betweening, any transition between those keyframes. It's going to hold that value until it sees another keyframe, and then the anchor point and position update. So I want all of these to hold, and then for the next roll, I'll move it again. And I got this yesterday as well. How did you get this issue? So the third roll, when you move the anchor point, did you get that? No. That's weird. I can't figure out why it's happening. So I'm going to put it down as a bug and save my sanity. But essentially, let's just do those two rolls. Luckily, the point of this exercise is that animating the anchor point like this is complicated and is not always going to work. So I think that bug kind of emphasizes that. So give that a go. Okay, so let's move on. I'll just show Jeremy's solution here. So essentially, I was trying to move it with the pan behind tool, and that has some sort of bug which is causing it to move the layer. So what he did was he moved the anchor point by value, but then that means he has to then move the position back, which luckily, because we're working on one dimension, not two, it's a little more accurate than we would expect, but there still might be a jump if you don't place it perfectly. So you can see if we look at this corner, I haven't quite aligned it perfectly, so it jumps position a little bit. Okay, so let's look at the next one. So animating the anchor point is painful, and in that instance we hadn't done any animation yet, and we're animating the anchor point while we were animating, which is a bit easier than if we've already animated. In this situation, it's already animated. So animating the anchor point is going to be really difficult, and I'll give you an example of that in a second. So what we want to do is use nulls to fake an anchor point. But let's first do the old method. So this object moves to the left, and then it moves to the right, and then it moves back. And if I look at the project name, it says anticipation and follow through. So just like if a character is moving, before they move, they probably go like this, and then they go forward. That's anticipation. Follow through is when I stop, I might lean over, or I might have some momentum going forward and then come back. So we want to do that here. So when this object eases into its motion, so it doesn't need anticipation here, we can get away without that, but it stops suddenly, so that momentum needs to go somewhere. So what I'd like to do is put the anchor point here and have it topple that way and then bounce back. But that's just an example, don't do that. But the problem is I've moved the anchor point, and look at my motion path. I've screwed up my motion path. So if I go back, now the anchor point is in that bottom corner, so it thinks that's where it has to align the object at that point in time. So it's screwed up all of my animation. So I don't want to do that. And animating the anchor point there is going to become really difficult. So instead, I want to use a null. So I'll create a new null, layer null. And just watch the screen for the moment, because I'll give you a chance to do it in a sec. And I want to find the point at which I need a different anchor point, which is right here on this keyframe. And then I'll put the null where I need an anchor point. And then what can I do to make that object follow that anchor point? Yeah. So I will name this null so I know what it is, because I might get more later. So I'll call it left anchor. And I will parent the square to the null. And that means the square can still animate, but when it gets to this point in time, I can now tilt the null and it'll take the square with it. But remember, it's taking the square and all of its animation with it. So if I go back now, the square animates up, and if I go forward, the square animates up, because I've tilted everything. So when I tilt it, and I'll send it back to 0, I want to start it at 0, tilt it, and then make sure I go back perfectly to 0, otherwise the rest of the animation is going to be screwed up. And then I'll just ease that, and I've created that fake anchor point that I can use to tilt that object. So go ahead and do that, and then see if you can figure out how to do the left side as well. I'm sorry, the right side as well. All right, let's have a look at the solution. Okay, so I've done the first one. And remember I said I wanted some anticipation as well. So before it moves again, I'm going to make sure it rotates again. So I'm just going to copy these keyframes and put them here just before it moves. So it takes a run up and then it moves again. But then when I get to here, I need it to rotate around this corner. I can't move this null because this square is parented to it. So I'm going to create a new null. And I'm going to place it on the corner. Now, one thing I want to do is just clean up my timeline a little bit. I know that this first null is only relevant from here to here. So I'm going to trim it so that I can see that in the timeline. And this new null is only relevant from here. So now that I can see that a bit better, I'm going to name this null right anchor, and I'm going to parent the square to the right anchor and hit R and keyframe and do the same thing. Now I might think that that works, and it does for this section. If I look at this, it works. But the problem is back here, the first null isn't doing anything anymore. It's not rotating the square because I've changed the parent of the square to the right anchor. It's no longer the left anchor. So I need it to stay the left anchor so that this has an effect. But when it gets to here, I need it to change to the right anchor. So there's two ways to do this. The first way is I can take the layer at this point in time, or this point, and I can split the square so that it's a completely different layer, and I can parent the second half to the right anchor. So the first one's parented to the left anchor, and then seamlessly it switches out to the second one, which is parented to the right anchor. Now that works, but it puts more layers in my timeline, which may or may not be the most appropriate answer. So I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to keep this one object, and I'm going to ask, how can I get the square to follow both of these anchors? So I just split the layer. How can I do it without splitting the layer?
Parenting one null to the other.
Yeah, so the square follows the left anchor because its parent says left anchor. If I make the left anchor's parent the right anchor, then when the right anchor moves, it takes with it the left anchor, which then takes with it the square. So it's kind of like parenting, it's kind of like doing a character animation, and the hand follows the forearm, but the hand should also follow the upper arm. But I don't parent the hand to the upper arm, I parent the forearm to the upper arm. So now the left anchor works and the right anchor works. And if I extend the left anchor out, I'll see that it gets dragged up as well. But we can't see that, it's invisible, so it doesn't matter. Okay, so we've looked at two methods so far, animating the anchor point and animating using nulls. And nulls is a bit more versatile. Let's look at a third method. So number 2, alternative method. Now it says, it's the same file, but now it says do the same thing using the transform effect. So you might not know where the transform effect is in the effects menu. So make sure you go over and look in the effects and presets palette, and you can just search transform. And if you can't see that palette, you can always change the views up here. So if I go small screen, it hides some of the palettes. If I go standard, it hides a lot of the palettes. If I go default, I see a bunch more. So if I select the layer and I double click on that transform effect, and I also know where it is now because it says it's under the distort menu. So if I go up to effects, distort, it's in here somewhere there. Okay, so this effect gives us another set of translation tools, translation properties. So if I open up my layer, I've got transform, which is for the layer in general, which we've seen before, but then I also have an effect called transform that has all those again. Okay, so I'm going to move the transform effects anchor point. And I can do that by either dragging these values, and I'll see that little circle there move, that's its anchor point, and that's the layer's normal anchor point. But it also changes the position. I can see that's where the layer usually is, but because of this effect, this is where the layer is now. So, I also, if I undo that, I can also click on this button here and say, I want to just click and say where the anchor point should be. So if I click on that, it gives me a crosshair that I can then just simply click in this corner and say that's where the anchor point should be. But again, it's moved the actual layer. Because it's moving the anchor point, the position is getting, the visuals of the position is getting screwed up. So I want to readjust the position to put it back into the right spot. And what I'll find is the value that it needs to be is actually exactly the same as the value of the anchor point. So I can type that in directly and know that it's in exactly the same spot as before, but I have an extra anchor point that I can use. So now if I hit R on the layer, rotation goes from the middle because that's a layer, but if I go up here and use rotation in the effect, it goes from the corner. So now all I need to do is find that point where the square hits, which is there, and keyframe rotation, move along, change the rotation, move along, change the rotation back. And I can hit U on the layer and see that rotation appear there. So without having any extra layers, I've got a new anchor point. Now before you go ahead with that, I'll show you the next rotation point. And I'll do something a little bit more advanced. So now I get to this point and I need a new anchor point. The anchor point for the effect hasn't moved with it, just like the null didn't move with it. So at this point in time, who can tell me how to add another anchor point?
Well, you could move the anchor point that's there under the normal transform controls, I guess.
Yep, so I could, just like I did in that first task, I could keyframe those.
Or you could just add another one of those effects.
Yeah. So during the first one, I could I could keyframe those to there and hold them, and then I can move it again and update this 1332 630, and so the anchor point moves, and I can rotate it again, and I'll just copy those rotations because they will probably be the same except maybe inverted. I moved that to the wrong spot, so I need to move it further. Okay. And rotate it in the opposite direction. Okay, so I've now done that by a combination of those last two things that we did. So we've got anchor point and position on the effect that suddenly moves, and then it rotates. Now that's perfectly reasonable way to do it, and it's probably the best way to do it. But your other suggestion, which is a good one as well, is to simply add another transform effect. And on that second transform effect, I'll collapse the first one. I can set up a whole different anchor point. Now, let's take this a step further. If I moved that anchor point, and I'll hit Y and I'll grab that anchor point and move it over here. It's really annoying that this moves, right? But we know that that position value to fix it needs to be exactly the same as that. So why don't we just automate that? Let's open up that effect and go to position, and using the parent and link tool, I can create an expression from that property to follow the other property. And it's given me an expression which looks like that, but I don't need to look at it. I can see from the red values it's linked to the other property, which means if I move the anchor point, on the fly it corrects the position values so that it's just like when I usually move the anchor point. And then, like before, I can just animate rotation. Okay, so give that a go with the transform effect. Sorry to interrupt again, but so I've given this anticipation as well, and I've changed the easing so it's a bit more comical. Once you've gotten this to a point where you feel like you understand that, there's 3 more tasks. The first one you won't be able to do. I shouldn't have included it, but it says using the anchor point, make this squash. But because it's already animated, it's going to be an absolute pain. So you can delete that one. Oops, you can delete that one. But the other 2 are the same, but it's just asking you to do that same technique, but we're going to squash it this time. So with this, it hits that point in time, and then you want a fake anchor point on that edge so that you can squash it down and bounce it back from the momentum. So once you're happy with that last one, alternative method, then go ahead and try those too. Okay, so I'll just do one of the squashing ones on screen. I'll just do using the transform effect because it's a much more useful one. So, square, I want to see where it animates, so it gets to here, and I'll notice it's already got some squash and stretch on it. So it's got scale already on it. As it moves, it stretches sideways, and then it snaps back when it hits the wall. That one stretches around the middle anchor point, because it's in the middle of space. It doesn't have anything to ground it. But when it hits the wall, it's pushing to the left, so it needs to hold that position on the edge. So I'll add the transform effect. I'll straight away go in and link that position to the anchor point, so I don't have to worry about it anymore. And then I know I need to animate it for the right hand side, so I'll add a keyframe for both of those immediately. Actually, I don't need a keyframe on position because it's going to follow the anchor point anyway. And then I'll keyframe scale. But I want to uncheck uniform scale, because otherwise all I can do is scale it proportionately. So I'll uncheck uniform scale. I'll scale height, and I'll keyframe height and keyframe width. And now everything's set up, except I still need to move that anchor point. So I'll grab this crosshair and I'll put it right on this edge. I should have zoomed in before I did that, but let's try again. Okay, so it's not quite there, but it's pretty close. I'll do it again. Just put it right on that point there. Okay. Now, everything's set up. All I need to do is animate the scale and height. So, their keyframe there. I'll hit U so that I can see all my keyframes down here. And then I'll move over a little bit. I'll scale the height up and I'll scale the width down. And then I'll move over a little bit and I'll copy both of those keyframes of 0 over to there. I'm going to ease both of these and I'll see how it looks. Okay, I might push that keyframe one earlier and spread these out and see if I can get it looking as smooth as possible. Okay, that's pretty reasonable. So now on the other side, when it hits this wall, I'll move the anchor point. So I'll click that crosshair again. And I'll go in here. And I won't bother zooming. And the anchor point has that keyframe. I need to hold this anchor point until there, and I'll hold that one as well, just for the hell of it. And then I can actually just use these same keyframes, because squash, the direction doesn't matter. It's still squashing in the same way. So I'll copy those and paste them, and it should look just as good as before. And that's it. So the other method was obviously to use the nulls. But I think you can see transform effect is much easier and cleaner, but sometimes nulls will be handy as well.